He was one of Russia's most versatile composers, who synthesized sounds from classicism to romanticism to modernism, in everything from the piano sonata to the film score. I'm the classical nerd, and today we're talking about Sergei Prokofiev. Prokofiev was born in April 1891 in what is now the Ukraine. His mother came from an extremely poor family who used to be serfs, and she understood the value of art, and she took piano lessons well into her adulthood. Sergei learned the piano through his mother, but he wanted not just to play pieces, he wanted to write his own, and he started doing this at the age of 5. His mother wrote them down for him. This fascination just stuck with him, and when he was 11, his mom got in touch with the folks at the Moscow Conservatory. The director, composer Sergei Taneyev, sent the composer and pianist Reinhold Glier to teach Prokofiev the following summer. Glier was very much a traditional romantic in his musical style and his output, and while Prokofiev was indebted to Glier for teaching him the basics and the rules, Prokofiev wanted to break those rules. After 2 summers of private study with Glier, the Prokofievs knew that they wanted their son to continue with music. They were rather doting on him, as he was the only surviving child in the family. All the same, they were very concerned that he wasn't going to get a well-rounded education if he didn't go to a very good high school, and all the good high schools they were looking at were in St. Petersburg, so off they went. But instead of looking at high schools, Sergei met the composer Alexander Glazunov, who was then a professor at the St. Petersburg Conservatory and was very soon to become its director. The prodigious talent of the still quite young Prokofiev impressed Glazunov deeply, and soon enough Sergei was enrolled as a student in the conservatory, where he proceeded to wow the professors and antagonize his fellow students, because he was on the young end of things. He was only 13 years old at the time, which would have made him, if not the youngest student of the conservatory, certainly amongst the youngest. He seemed to have thought that in order to get even, he needed to bring the other students down a peg. His music took a turn for the acidic, as he'd write these short and bitingly dissonant pieces for solo piano, which naturally he'd perform himself. It wasn't long before St. Petersburg as a whole knew that they had a musical bad boy on their hands, and he was able to parlay this into his first publishing contract, which was great for him because he needed to be able to support himself more after his father died. After graduating from St. Petersburg in 1914, Prokofiev set out west, where he met the ballet impresario Sergei Diaghilev, who ran the Ballet Russe. This was primarily based out of Paris, because French culture was hog wild about Russian culture, and vice versa. They had this weird continent-spanning bromance going on when it came to what culture each country admired the most. At that point, the Parisian audiences were wild not just about Russia, but about Russian paganism, about the far reaches of Siberia, and all of the weird and exotic things that came out of that. Just the previous year, Diaghilev had commissioned the explosive Rite of Spring from Igor Stravinsky, another young Russian composer, and that premiere caused a literal riot. But Diaghilev knew that riots were good for business, and the more people were talking about the Ballet Russe, the more money he and all the composers he would commission would make. And he also was fond of commissioning composers who were not very well known at the time, because they wouldn't demand the kind of high fees that established composers would. And the establishment composers were not interested in writing the kind of avant-garde music that Diaghilev was looking for. The problem is that while Stravinsky was willing to write in an idiom that encompassed Russian folk tunes and savage rhythms, Prokofiev's music at this point in time was a little bit more abstract. Diaghilev pushed him to write music that was a little bit more Stravinskyan and took a little bit more after the kinds of elements that Stravinsky had used in the Rite, and the resulting piece was resounding in its success. Prokofiev's ballet score Shoot was hailed as a work of absolute genius. When World War I erupted, Prokofiev made his way back to St. Petersburg, and he re-entered the conservatory as a student of the organ. He knew that he was going to be exempt from military service. He wasn't going to get drafted because he was the only surviving son of a widow, and as the only male provider in the family, they thought it was unethical to draft someone in that position. When the Russian Revolution hit, Prokofiev was overjoyed at the news of the overthrow of the Tsar, like many Russian citizens were. The problem was in all the political turmoil and strife that came after that. Performances of his works were cancelled, or delayed, or moved, and he was actually stuck in the Caucasus for a time, unable to get out due to all the fighting. He was eventually able to apply to leave the country, and somewhat miraculously, they allowed him to do that. But his idea was that he was going to go to the United States, and he couldn't quite do that via Europe. So he decided to take the long way around. He took an overland route through Siberia, sailed to, well, Japan first, where he concertized a little bit, and then to San Francisco, where he was immediately detained by immigration officers and interrogated, because apparently some things never change in this country. They figured he was alright to stay, and so he immediately began concertizing around the country, stockpiling money, and trying to get interest in a new satirical opera he was planning that he called The Love for Three Oranges. A production of The Love for Three Oranges fell through in the United States due to circumstances well outside of his control, which is a recurring theme when you look at anything operatic written by Prokofiev. He also seemed to think that he, as a Russian expatriate, would have the kind of rip-roaring success that Sergei Rachmaninoff had had when he came to the United States. But the problem was not really the difference between Rachmaninoff's more romantic musical language and Prokofiev's more modernistic musical language, but rather that Rachmaninoff was known as a great performer and interpreter of other composers' works, whereas Prokofiev was a little bit more pigeonholed as just a pianist who played his own works. So, underwhelmed by his good but not great American reception, Prokofiev decided to return to Paris, where he reconnected with his old friends Diaghilev and Stravinsky. Stravinsky might have been a great fan of Prokofiev's ballet works, but he was not a fan of what he heard of The Love for Three Oranges. The relationship between Prokofiev and Stravinsky was rocky, but they had a mutual respect for one another and one another's music. Stravinsky said that Prokofiev was the greatest Russian composer, after himself, naturally, but also said that outside of music, Prokofiev was an idiot. This is blatantly untrue because Prokofiev was also a really, really good chess player. He was friends with world-class players, he would go toe-to-toe with them, and occasionally beat them. Prokofiev realized that his reputation as a young hotshot modernist was only good insofar as he was still young and a hotshot, and he had been on the scene for far too long to still be the next big thing. He spent some time in Germany and then in France again, and he realized that his brand of modernism had been leapfrogged, that audiences, especially in Paris, were looking for something that went further beyond the modernism that he was trying to bring to the table. You see, Prokofiev was trying to imbue the emotion of Romanticism with the phrase structure of Classicism and the harmonic language of modernism. And audiences who were looking for modernist music were looking for things that went totally beyond that broke even more rules than just that of voice leading. After encircling the world, quite literally, over the period of several years, Prokofiev understandably got homesick, and so he returned to his homeland in the late 1920s. While the Marxist regime of the Soviet Union is often viewed as being inherently acerbic towards any and all modernist artists, that really only became a huge issue after Stalin seized power. Before then, the authorities weren't all that concerned about music that was on the avant-garde because they could make a case for that being revolutionary. This isn't to say that supermodernist pieces were given the thumbs up by the government, and they were still subject to censure from semi-official agencies of the Communist Party, but it wasn't like you were going to get thrown in a gulag if you wrote something that was too outlandish. Not then. That came later. For a while, because Prokofiev was known around the world, the Soviets liked him because he was a world-famous comrade and revolutionary. They wanted to use that as a ploy and basically as a propaganda tool in the West. And you see this with any Soviet artist that came later that became famous in the West. The certain amount of fame outside of the Soviet Union helped to protect their artistic integrity and reputation, or at the very least, their lives. He still got harassed by semi-official wings of the Communist Party and was occasionally told to cut something or censure this or whatever, but it wasn't a huge deal, and Importantly, he was not tied down to the Eastern Bloc. He could tour Europe and America pretty much as he pleased. He continually wrote operas, even though he continually ran into problems in getting them produced. But fear not, he was able to use the best material from these operas and turn them into his symphonies. He also accepted commissions from a wide variety of sources, including the Library of Congress, who commissioned his first string quartet. This would have been unthinkable after World War II. The Depression took a big bite out of his compositional time, and he found himself engaged more and more often strictly for his services as a pianist in Europe. He wanted more time to compose, and he wanted more commissions. In order to do this, he began cozying up to the Soviet authorities. They realized that they could use Prokofiev for their own ends, because he could be a potential artistic tie between the Soviet Union and Europe. From the early 1930s onwards, Prokofiev watered down a little bit the style that made him famous, because the more accessible his music was, the more commissions he would receive. By 1938, he had moved back to Moscow for good, and his passport was revoked. Stalin had a firm grip on power, and his control over Soviet artistry had a huge impact on what kinds of music that Prokofiev would write going forward. He sated his government's desire for music that appealed popularly to the people by setting poems about the proletariat, and he got a lot of material out of his collaborations with Soviet filmmakers. His contemporary Dmitri Shostakovich was outright fearing for his life, like sleeping underneath the staircase kind of fearing for his life, but Prokofiev was more well regarded by the authorities, and he was more careful. Prokofiev was just in general a little bit more liked by the authorities, and he was able to write music in the style of Socialist Realism, and basically whatever Stalin wanted him to do, such as when he was invited to write the cantata Zdravitsa. I think I'm pronouncing that right. It means like cheers or a toast, but is commonly known by another English translation, which is Hail to Stalin, because it's a poem about how great Stalin is. Basically, the rule is, when you're talking about Stalin, he's at least twice as narcissistic as you thought he was. And it's a shame, because this is actually, it's not a bad piece. It's not a bad cantata, but understandably, there are not very many performances or recordings of this thing anymore. Prokofiev, like Shostakovich, or really any other composer of the Soviet Union, found ways to keep his inner artistic flame alive, while still writing music that kept the government off of his back. But while Shostakovich found ways to satisfy the authorities just enough to keep him from getting arrested and killed, writing music that was more personal for the proverbial bottom drawer, Prokofiev's personal pieces were performed and were actually liked, which is very odd. 2 out of his 3 so-called war sonatas, given that title because they were written during the World War II years, were given the Stalin Prize, which is basically the highest honor you could get. He also, for some reason, thought Leo Tolstoy's epic, infamously long novel War and Peace would make a good operatic subject, and it kinda did, as long as you can find an opera company that's willing to put on such a huge production. Even so, Prokofiev was not immune to the policies of Socialist Realism, and especially in any stage work, cuts and revisions were demanded. By the time World War II ended, the Soviets clamped down on any art they thought was un-Soviet. They banned music that was formalist, that is, any music that existed on its own turf. Basically, art had to be Soviet propaganda. In the crosshairs of this newfound censorship were the best Soviet composers of the era, Prokofiev amongst them. Their music was branded as cacophonous, and large swaths of their work were banned, including in Prokofiev's case, one of the war sonatas that had won the Stalin Prize. This cut down on the amount of money that Prokofiev was able to make, and so debt piled up. His estranged wife Lena was arrested on espionage charges and sent to the gulags, and his own high blood pressure caused him serious health problems, and his doctors told him to limit his compositional time to about an hour per day. In 1948, he denounced all of his earlier compositions, in a ploy to get on the good side of the Composers' Union once again, but it was all for naught. Socialist realism was a policy that was used as a cudgel by the authorities to clamp down on anyone they just didn't like. As a result, what they told composers to do in their works was often contradictory. There was no way for Prokofiev to bring his personal, mature musical language into agreement with the state doctrine. In one of the cruelest bits of timing in the annals of Western music, Prokofiev died at the age of 61 from a cerebral hemorrhage on March 5th, 1953, the same day as Joseph Stalin. His death went almost completely unnoticed. He lived near Red Square, and for 3 whole days they were unable to get his body out of his apartment complex because of the throngs of people mourning the fallen dictator outside. Prokofiev's funeral was lightly attended, as you might imagine, but amongst the attendees was none other than Dmitri Shostakovich. Prokofiev and Shostakovich may have had their disagreements, but Shostakovich was going to do his part to honor a composer who was also in the fight with him against such totalitarianism. In doing so, Shostakovich, who was still fearing for his life under Stalin's regime, was putting his own neck out there on the chopping block. He didn't suffer the consequences for missing Stalin's funeral, but he very easily could have. Lena Prokofiev was released from the Gulag archipelago after Stalin's death, and she was able to make a modest living off of royalties of her late husband's work, as even though they were separated, they were never officially divorced. Within 4 years of his death, his image had been totally rehabilitated, as the Soviets realized that it was probably a good thing to promote a Soviet artist that the West knew and enjoyed, much as they still were doing with Shostakovich. The Prokofiev name has lived on in the history of music, including his grandson, Gabriel Prokofiev, who is the only composer I know of to have written a concerto for bass, drum, and orchestra, but he's probably best known for his work as a DJ and record producer. Prokofiev's music was always tinged with his desire to be original above all else. He said that he detested imitation, and he tried to bring into balance the kind of classical forms and grace that he was imbued with from his very earliest years, with the kinds of acidic harmonies that he discovered on his own, that he discovered could wrench powerful emotions from his listeners. He wanted his music to be described as, and thought it was at its best when it could be called, scherzo-ish. He wanted whimsy, and he wanted mockery. Like Shostakovich, he seemed to agree, at least in theory, with the party line, that music was for the people, and should be accessible to wide swaths of untrained non-musicians. Not what the West had become, which was more of a specialist's field, where music was only understandable to those with a high degree of training. The problem was that, as mentioned, the Soviet officials used this as a cudgel against composers they simply just didn't like. Prokofiev did not write music that pandered to the widest possible audience, but he was at least aware of them. He wanted to write serious music for a public that he saw as in desperate need of hearing serious music. Aside from this, he claimed no precompositional techniques or approaches. Prokofiev may have had a reputation as an exciting modernist, but he was actually a very flexible and capable composer in a great many fields. His first symphony, commonly called the Classical Symphony, written between 1916 and 1917, attempted to depict what Joseph Haydn may have written if he were alive during Prokofiev's lifetime. This was the first piece in a spate of pieces written by many different composers between World War I and World War II, called neoclassical pieces. It was the neoclassical Renaissance, if you will. Although many composers who were writing neoclassical pieces, like Stravinsky would in the 1920s, were really writing neo-Baroque pieces, or pieces that were inspired in equal parts from the Baroque and classical eras. It's a kind of confusing term, and it doesn't actually accurately represent what people usually think it does, except in the case of Prokofiev's Classical Symphony. Prokofiev, for his part, was kind of over this kind of overt neoclassicism right when Stravinsky began using it as the basis for his entire so-called Second Period, which began roughly around 1920. By the time Prokofiev wrote his Second Symphony, he had already moved so far away from that style that he wrote a piece that even he couldn't understand. Early theorists who turned their attention towards Prokofiev saw some common characteristics throughout some of his pieces, including what they called a Prokofiev dominant, where instead of a dominant chord in a certain place, he would just have a triad built a step below scale degrees 1 or 5. This seems to have emerged primarily out of Prokofiev's desire for unconventional voice leading. In this sense, Prokofiev was taking after a tradition that stretched back further than him in the annals of Russian music, something that was first codified in a textbook by Nikolai Rimsky-Korsakov, who encouraged experimentation amongst his students when it came to harmonic voice leading. As long as the voice leading was good, it didn't have to be traditional. Prokofiev used this approach in conjunction with his willingness to use, say, parallel fifths, something that you do not see in very many types of voice leading, which led to unconventional harmonies and unconventional modulations. Prokofiev is sort of infamous for going anywhere at any time, sort of hold on to your seat, we are going to a crazy key that you never even heard of before. Some analysts, supported by a remark from the composer's son Oleg, have basically seen Prokofiev's musical language as one that is fundamentally diatonic. And indeed, you can't understand Prokofiev's music without understanding that he was a composer who was not afraid of writing unique and original diatonic melodies. The thing is that they see the diatonicism as sort of the underlying bed of musical material, where wrong notes are added, or entire passages moved up or down half steps for the sake of jarring the listener out of what they expect to happen. This wrong note theory certainly does hold some validity if you look at certain passages. But the problem with any one-sided theoretical approach to Prokofiev's music is that you are taking, again, a one-sided approach to music that is extremely complex. After all, it was Prokofiev who referred to Stravinsky's neoclassical works as Bach on the wrong notes, or, more literally, Bachisms with false notes. Diaghilev may have been convinced that ballet was the future and that opera was dying, but Prokofiev was a profoundly good composer for both mediums. He understood stage works. The problem is that many of his productions fell through due to socio-political circumstances, or due to an impresario dying, in the case of The Love for Three Oranges, and how that fell through in America, or how another production fell through in the Soviet Union because the director he was going to work with was rounded up by the secret police and shot. The longer you think about it, the more incredible it is that figures like Prokofiev were able to stay largely outside of this violence. It happened to people that they knew, people who were in their circle, but it didn't happen to them. And like Shostakovich, it was his fame in the West that prevented him from getting shipped off to the gulags as well. Shostakovich lived longer and became more well-known in the West, while Stravinsky, from his home in Los Angeles, was free to do basically whatever he wanted to do. So while Prokofiev's music has never been overlooked, especially by pianists who love the concerti and the sonatas, his music has never been on equal footing with those other two great Russian composers from around the same period of time. As time has passed, his multifaceted, utilitarian approach to music, which encompassed and referenced multiple traditions, has been more thoroughly analyzed. But no matter what angle you take, Prokofiev's music always stands out as uniquely his own.